Good morning, everybody. Guten Morgen. That's the best German I can do. So, is everybody awake, having fun yet? Okay. They say fake it till you make it, except with metrics. We're going to not do that. I'm Julia Wester. I live in Seattle, Washington, and I'm an independent consultant. Essentially what that means is I help people do more work with less stress, or I help them remove unnecessary drama from their day. However you like to name it, that's sort of what I do. And today I'm here to talk to you about finding metrics that matter and using them safely. Okay? So we're going to dig into that a little bit. Now, how many here are hoping that I will tell you all the DevOps metrics to use? Okay, well, I'm going to give you some because I know you want that. But I'm going to tell you why you might not want to listen to me and you might want to decide for yourself. Okay. So we suffer from a syndrome of too many metrics. Does anybody feel like they have a gluttony of metrics that you could be looking at or are looking at, but you get absolutely no information from them, or you don't know what to do with what you have? Sometimes too much information is as bad as too little, especially when you don't know how to use it. The reason we have too many metrics a lot of the time is because when we don't know what to measure, we measure what's easy, what's available, what's there. And we don't understand the consequences of those actions. We're going to talk through that a little bit today. Now, unfortunately for people who want super simple, easy answers, there is no one perfect set of metrics that is a one-size-fits-all for everyone. And we'll explain why that is, so I apologize, but I'm still going to give you some good baseline metrics, because I like to think of it as when I go to the doctor, and I'm assuming there's some of it that's the same worldwide, right? I go in, and a nurse at least, they check my blood pressure, they take my temperature, they do some baseline things, no matter what I'm there for, right? Those are just good things to know all the time. So there are definitely some metrics that are probably just good to see all of the time. But what I wouldn't like when I go to the doctor is for the doctor just to start prescribing me things without understanding why I'm there and what problems that I have. And so metrics are exactly the same way. There are some that are probably just good to have, but the rest, we need to understand what problems we're experiencing and take that information and go figure out which particular metrics we want to measure so that we can achieve our goals. So that's the story for that. Now, what we need to really take care and understand is that what you measure, the fact that you measure it, you take the time to gather that data, you put it somewhere where it's visible, even if it's hidden in a system somewhere, if people know that you care about that metric, they are going to optimize and make that metric look good. Someone is going to care. Someone is going to think it's my job to make that thing look good. And so when we're just randomly trying out things, what we're doing is we're sending all of these signals that may have unintended consequences. So a big part of what we want to talk about today is understanding the unintended consequences of the metrics that we choose. Now, I've been looking a lot at what happens when we operate at extremes and finding sort of the sweet spot of where we should be operating when we make different decisions, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit today. But in doing that, I started looking up systems thinking. What's the definition of systems thinking? And Peter Senge, who is a senior lecturer at MIT Sloan School of Management, and he wrote the book The Fifth Dimension, I think, The Learning Organization. He says that he's well-renowned as one of the experts in systems thinking. And he defines systems thinking as understanding the consequences of your actions. So today we're going to become better systems thinkers. Okay? Systems are made up of a bunch of interactions that collide with each other. It's not, being a good system thinker is not understanding how that system works. It's understanding all the interactions that go in together. And when you make a decision, you send ripple waves out into all those interactions and understanding what impacts that has. Okay. So we're going to talk about not necessarily finding the one right way to do your metrics, but some ways to make using those metrics safer. And then I'm going to give you some metrics that you might want to start with if you don't know where to start and how to use them in a safe way, but then help you, find a way to go figure out what metrics you need to use. Okay. So does anybody, I like to ask questions. I'm bubbly, I'm a talker, I like to connect with people. So sometimes I ask questions of the audience. And so answer me if you want to, don't if you don't want to. What do you think is the very first thing you need to know before you choose a metric? What do you need to have? A benchmark, or would you say that to you is the same thing as a goal or an outcome you want to achieve? Field of application? Yeah, all those things are, that makes sense. Those are all important. What you definitely need to have, in addition to some of those things, is an outcome that you want to achieve. Our metrics that we use are tools to help us understand what's happening, and knowing that they do impact behavior, use the right metrics that can induce positive behaviors for positive interactions and impacts on our system. So just like this little Lego dude here who is orienting around, he has a place he wants to go. He's just not wandering in the woods. So we don't want to wander in the woods either, the metaphorical woods. We want to have an idea of what we want to achieve, either a goal or a problem that we need to solve, something that points us in a direction. Then we're going to walk the path. Okay? A lot of times we start with metrics and then we work our way backwards, but really we want to start with outcomes and work our way to the metrics. So this is called Odom, or Outcome Decision Insight Measure. And this is from a data scientist that I know well named Larry Maccheroni. He used to work with Rally. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that tool. Is now on to other things. But he has studied lots and lots of data sets from many, many Agile teams and has really come up with some great tools. And this is one of the good thinking processes he's given us. Essentially, I have an outcome I want to achieve. So let's say I want to do something everyone wants to do, which is deliver value more frequently. Okay? Now that I have that outcome, I have to think about different decisions that I think I need to make to get myself to that outcome. It won't be a one-to-one mapping. You might have to do this process multiple times because you'll have multiple decisions for one outcome. But one decision that I can make, and if you're in my workshop yesterday, you'll know I'm a Kanban person. I talk about work in process limits all the time. So one of the things that we have to decide when we want to deliver more work more frequently is, should we start more and more work, or should we limit how much work we have in our system so that we can focus and get done faster? Okay. Let's say we don't know if we need to do that yet. So that's a decision that we need to make. Now, an insight I need to have to make that decision is to find out, do work in process levels, the amount of work I have in my system, is that in any way correlated with the speed at which I deliver it? Because maybe you don't want to take my word for it, which I think is great. You should always prove things to yourself. Okay? So then in order to get that insight to help me make that decision to reach my outcome, what can I measure? So I can look at two things in tandem. I can look at the team's current WIP levels, the work in process levels, alongside the duration, and see if when I have more work in my system, does my speed go down, and vice versa. And then I can prove to myself whether or not there's a correlation. I can make a decision to do more work or less work, and that should help me further along in my outcome that I want to achieve. Okay? So we want to start with Odom, Outcome, Decision, Insight, and Measure. Now, we have a lot of metrics that we use that we don't always truly understand what they tell us. You might hear these called productivity metrics or vanity metrics. It's like looking at, I'm dating myself, but your Facebook posts, right? And they could have all these likes on them. It doesn't mean that you're awesome, right? Personally, It means you had a post someone liked and clicked liked a lot, right? So what we tend to do is conflate a lot of different metrics, and I'll give you some examples in a second. But we look at a metric that says, I get a lot done. I do a lot of these things. And we conflate, or we confuse it with the fact that, or with the thought that it's saying, I add so much value. But activity does not always equal value or progress. Okay? So just because these tell us how much we do instead of how much value we generate doesn't make them a bad metric necessarily. We'll talk about how to make them safer to use. One of my favorite ones to hate is lines of code written. Can anybody tell me why having more lines of code may not be a great idea? I mean, I would like to, reward people for removing code and make it better, right? So if I measure people on lines of code, they're going to generate really big, fat code, right? Because why not? Never write something in 5 lines when you can do it in 50, right? And get the bonus. So I don't want that. Number of issues closed. I totally think that's a good thing to track. That's probably one of my baseline metrics. I'll talk about it later. But I need to understand that it doesn't tell me anything about the value we delivered in that. We could close 10 tickets. What does that mean? You have no idea. You don't know what those tickets were if you're just looking at that metric. Okay? Same thing with number of deploys per day. Now, that is in the State of DevOps report, the DevOps handbooks. We should be caring about how many deploys a day we do. And we should, because that is trying to get us insights about how easy it is to deploy our code. If we're doing it a lot, we must have figured out how to do it better. So in that respect, it's a meaningful metric. We'll talk a little bit later about expiration dates and what happens when you use a metric beyond its expiration date. And if you're doing any sort of Scrum or story pointing, a number of points finished, is a little crazy. I had a VP who wanted to have, I can totally get this, he wanted to understand what success looked like across all of his teams and wanted to be able to say, is this team more successful than that team? And I completely understand why he wants that, right? He wants to know who needs help so he can level everybody up. But again, he wanted to use the metrics that we had. So we had story points and we had some other things. And I had to go and say, well, if I told you this team did 5 points, what does that mean to you? 5. Does that make you feel good? What about 10 over here? And I just had to help him understand that that metric did not tell him what he needed to know, even though every team had that metric. So we have to talk a little bit about what those metrics really tell us. So if we can try to take these and add some additional information, so if we can say how many issues we closed or how many deploys we made alongside how much revenue did we generate or protect. So there's a lot of work that we do that falls into different categories. And the way that we can look at value can be across these 4 different buckets. Did I generate revenue? That's the sexy stuff that product owners like to prioritize, right? It's all the fun features and things that people pay for. So revenue generation. But a lot of what we do, especially in ops and in IT, we protect the revenue that we already have. Okay? And if you've ever been in customer success or in sales and you're working on a SaaS product, you know that the money is in keeping the customers you have. You get a lot more money over time from existing customers than you do from one initial sale. So protecting revenue is as important as generating revenue. Not everybody understands that yet, though. We have to help them get there. But if we start attaching some of these numbers to some of these measures that we already have, then, or at least trying to approximate some understanding of that, then we can start making these metrics a little more meaningful. And just like revenue generated or protected, we have cost avoided or cost saved. So if you do this upgrade or do this migration, then you can avoid incurring the costs you've been avoiding, or you can save future costs by not having to renew this contract if we move over or something like that. So the point here is that we just really want to understand what each metric is telling us and not fool ourselves. Once we have a set of metrics, then we can put them to a really easy so what test. Okay? There's just 2 questions on this so what test. If it doesn't pass this test, get rid of it. The first question is, does this matter to my customer? Uptime, 99.999% or whatever, 5 nines, 4 nines. That probably matters to them, although we know that that number can mean a lot of different things based on what's in your contract, right? Some contracts say uptime does not include planned maintenance or all these other things, right? So all uptime is not created equal. All downtime doesn't have the same impact. So not all downtime is created equal. Okay. But does it matter to my customer? Will they be upset if this tanks? If so, keep it. And if it doesn't pass that question, move on. Well, it doesn't matter to my customer, but does it help me make a decision or help me take an action that will further us being able to achieve our goals? So that's a super simple so what test. Okay, so if we're doing all of this so far, then we are way better than most people in trying to use metrics that will help us achieve our goals instead of what we already have. In perpetuating problems we already have and creating new ones. One thing that, when you think about it, makes sense, but not a lot of people talk about, unless you've heard some people like Larry Materoni or Troy McGinnis talk, is that we want to choose metrics that are in tension, okay? And why? Can anybody sort of guess before I tell you why choosing metrics in tension, metrics that might compete with each other, why do we think that's a good thing to do? How does that help us protect us from ourselves?
Might be like a double check. So if one metric goes down, the other should go up, and opposite around.
Absolutely. What it does is it helps us see the correlation between one action that we do to fix a metric over here. Have you ever had fixed it here, broke it there syndrome? Right? That happens to us all the time. Well, that happens with metrics, but most times we don't see it. We don't always see the consequences of the actions that we take. But when we choose to measure things that compete with each other, that have natural tension, because not all tension is bad, then we are setting ourselves up for the ability to be able to see those negative consequences if they happen. So we call this sort of a balanced metrics dashboard. And here's where I'm going to get into some metrics and some areas of balanced tension that you can use if you don't know where else to start. So just a disclaimer, when we go through these are not the metrics, okay? These are just some metrics that you have to decide whether they will help you achieve your goals. Okay, so if you have no idea what to do and you're looking to find some balanced metrics, then you can start by thinking of these 4 categories. Okay. We all care about quality. How good is the work we do? How much is it helping our business? We also need to be responsive. If we take 4 years to fine-tune things and move deck chairs around, then it doesn't matter how good it is, we've missed our time to market. So we also have to have speed. We have to be responsive to our customers in the market. We do need to care about how much of the stuff we're generating. Can we keep up with demand? And then all of those other things, can we keep doing that over and over? We might be able to do it for a, firefighting weekend, but that's not sustainable. Can we sustain all of this quality and speed and productivity in the long haul? Okay? So this might be your balanced dashboard. So you can probably predict that we're going to put metrics in these quadrants so that we can see them all in one space. So that when something happens to push this metric up over here, we're going to be able to see, did this break something in another area that's also important to us or not? I like to think of it as, anybody hate wobbly restaurant tables? as much as I do. I hate them. Like you're going and you sit down, you're like, crap, this thing is going to move every time I move. And you're looking for stuff to stick under that leg just to make the madness stop. Well, we don't want our businesses to be wobbly either. We don't want to have one really strong leg of quality and one really weak leg of responsiveness. So you could think of this as sort of a four-legged table that we need to keep balanced. Okay? We don't always want to optimize the heck out of quality and sacrifice the other leg. It's not a good, healthy thing. So let's dive into at least a couple of different metrics that you can use for each of these four quadrants. So to give you some ideas of places to start. Okay. So quality. I was a dev manager in IT at F5 Networks. Maybe some of you are in ops and know about F5 hardware and software and all that jazz. Load balancers. Haven't been there in a few years, though. But I had to do quarterly business reviews. And I had to report on issues by application or service. And we looked at it in month over month and quarter over quarter. Okay? So my team had something like 60 different applications that we owned because we had lots of tiny little PHP apps and some major Java apps. So I wanted to see with this metric, which were my problematic apps over time. Yeah, it might be interesting if I have a short spike where one all of a sudden had a lot of issues. I'm more concerned about which over time is generally causing the most dysfunction because it lets me as a manager and lets our leads know, hey, if we focus our efforts over here, then we're likely to reclaim a lot of capacity and time and energy that we could use for something more productive. So looking at this over time and seeing trend lines are really important. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. So issues by application or service helps us find our problem apps and focus there. Yeah? Totally, you can do that. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if this does this, well, it doesn't tell you that you have to go resolve that, right? But you're right. If I had additional insight into the value of the application or the impact if it was down, that's a really good insight. So if, like I said before, all downtime isn't created equal, right? If I have a server that goes down, if there's no customers on it, is it a problem? Probably, but not right this second. You know, we need to get it up. So I think of what you said in a very similar way. If I have an app that not many people are using, but it has the most incidents, that's something that I need to keep in mind as compared to another app on here that may have less incidents, but has a bigger impact. So that's a very good insight to say, I should maybe add some more information to this, or I should remember that we can't take every metric at face value and assume it tells us everything that we need to know to make our decisions. It's one factor. So you get a gold star. Good job. Okay. Now, another way that we can look at quality is obviously customer satisfaction. So you can do this with your actual customers. You can do it with your internal stakeholders. There's always the lovely post-incident surveys that are on Zendesk or ServiceNow or whatever that you use. And that works. They usually get a pretty low response rate, but it's worth doing. You get that information. So we have a chart over here that's sort of like month over month, our satisfaction survey rates and how good they are. And over here on the right is a more qualitative kind of way to get feedback from people. So again, at F5, what I did when I was trying to figure out what team success looked like, and I said, if my stakeholders are happy and my team is happy, then we're doing something right at least. So let me try to measure that. And so I had a more qualitative measure, and I asked every stakeholder, every sprint that we dealt with, you know, what's your satisfaction level? And we sort of tracked that. So try to get some understanding of your satisfaction, even if it's qualitative. Qualitative metrics are okay to use. Okay, so those are some ideas for quality. The next area was responsiveness. So duration or cycle time, I like to put duration up there because people use different words for durations. There's lots of types of durations you can measure. Some people say that when you get the request to when it's complete, that's a lead time duration. People call cycle time from when you start the request to when it's finished. And there's lots of different things people call that. So I have that up there in parentheses, but duration. Okay. And this is an example of a jitter plot or a scatter plot. And each dot on here is one card or one issue that we finished. And the axis, vertical axis, is how long it took to finish that piece of work. So we can see here that a lot of our work finishes in a very low cycle time, but we have a chunk that is a little higher and then some outliers. And we can start to notice patterns. And we can say, maybe this bit that's down here is one type of work. And we could say, what about this sort of grouping up here? Is that because it's a different type of work? We could start to look at that. Then we could start to say, okay, how can we learn to make commitments based on how fast we've done work in the past? That's one thing this report can help us with. And you see this percentile line. So when we teach people how to make commitments in the kind of work that I do, instead of giving people a precise date, because there's a lot of impact there, we don't want to assume that we know the day it's going to start and that we know everything we need to know. What we can do by this is then look and say, well, how certain do we need to be? Do we need to be 99% certain? You never can be 100% certain if you're using past information as an indicator. Are we okay with 85%? That's usually what people are okay with. And then you can find, okay, what's the line where 85 or 90% of our work, completed in that time or less? And we can say, okay, I can give you with sort of 95% confidence that we'll finish that piece in 10 days or less. Okay? And so this is across all of the work. And if you start breaking down the different types of work, if you identify different categories and you get just the visual of that segmentation of your work, this is one way that people can start to make SLAs on, this type of work generally takes us this long, that type of work generally takes us that long. So you can get pretty good indicators from this simple information, or you can take duration information, start and end dates of each item, and feed them into more complex systems like probabilistic forecasting tools that run thousands of simulations of factors and can give you maybe slightly more robust probabilities. But looking at your duration allows you to give probabilities of when things are likely to be finished. Another thing for responsiveness is mean time to recovery, mean time to resolution. And again, this is where we want to look at the fact that not all outages are created equal. So we can't necessarily say that when the number was higher, we were worse at what we were doing. Maybe that outage was not as important. So again, you can't take everything at exactly face value, but it doesn't mean that it's not worth gathering this and then just having something to check and balance it alongside. So another responsive metric is mean time to recovery. And I pulled some graphics from lots of different types of tools, so not to sort of pick on one and favorite one versus the other. Okay, another one of this was a vanity metric. This was this tells how much we do, not how awesome we are, right? But I still think it's a good indicator. It just can't be looked at by itself, because then people will negatively optimize for it. So a productivity metric is going to have those kinds of things, and it is one of our quadrants. So we might look at throughput. And here we see sort of a month over month, and you can see the relationship. We can put trend lines on here, and then it has further broken down what type of work in that month. Okay? And again, because it is a productivity metric, sort of gold star if you also add some sort of value alongside. We generated this many issues, we closed this many issues, and here was the value it added. So if you can get the people that are putting in the requests, if you can have them start having conversations about value, even if you're not all the way to dollars yet, if you can have some baby step towards, or euros, sorry, if you have some baby step towards understanding what the value is, then you can have a better understanding of the value your team is doing for the organization. And from being a manager, I know that people in development teams, people in ops teams, want to feel like they're adding value to the organization. Everybody wants to feel like they are doing something important, not that they're just killing themselves for crap nobody cares about, right? So it's always good for everyone to understand the value that they add. Okay. Another is deployment frequency. I talked about this a little bit before. Just like throughput, it's important to know how often we're deploying because it gives us indicators of the more we do it, maybe the easier it is, the less we do it, do we have a problem, right? It's not telling us we have a problem. It's not telling us it's bad if we do it less often, but it might cause us to start asking questions if we're going fast, 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 and suddenly we're not deploying anymore, right? So these are indicators to look at. And again, if you can add value, even better. Okay, and the last quadrant, sustainability. Okay. One of the things that you can do is say, are we keeping pace with demand? So you could just call this open versus closed. You could have a regular bar chart with open and closed next to each other for Q1, Q2, Q3. This is an interesting way to visualize it called a net flow chart. So this is just the difference, okay? So the red bars, every month or a week or whatever, there's a red bar. That means we started, or more came in than we finished. So we weren't keeping pace with demand. And every time there's a green bar, we were exceeding the pace of the demand. So yay. And ideally, we're sort of zeroed out, right? We're staying pretty even flow. So this highlights the differences in the bars. So it's a cool way, another way to look at what otherwise might be a side-by-side bar chart. Okay. And then finally, it doesn't matter what all those other things say if your team's about to quit, right? Because you're not going to be able to do all of that anymore if everyone walks out the door. Okay? I started asking people in one-on-ones occasionally, if you were offered this job today, would you still take it? Right? Because that was my success metric for me. I needed to know if I was doing a good job, making a good environment for my people to be able to do their good work. Okay, so another way you might want to ask is sort of like an NPS, Net Promoter Score for your employees. Normally we do that for customers. But that's essentially saying to your team, would you recommend that your best friend or relatives work here at this company? Do you think so highly of working here that you should tell everyone that that's a good thing to do? It's a really good indicator. There are other things that you can do to measure team happiness. This is there's one version of this called a kiwi dial, and it's just because the little dial is a kiwi bird and goes back and forth. And there's online versions of this. You see this in sort of like airport bathrooms in Seattle. There's one on the exit for each door. You walk out, you hit the happy face or the sad face, depending on if you liked how clean the bathroom was. Same kind of thing. This is a Nico chart, or calendar rather. And people, sort of for each day, they say, this is how I feel today. Things suck. So I'm going to put a big sad face here. Or I'm really happy today. So big green happy faces. And you notice it's less about the individual day, the individual person, more about the trends over time. Sometimes your teams will do this kind of stuff for you, and you have to pay attention and look. One day I walked up to the whiteboard because we all got up around a whiteboard that had our Kanban on it, and I saw a dramometer. Someone drew a thermometer, called it a dramometer, drama meter, And the levels were chocolate, beer, wine, and liquor, right? And so I knew, as a manager, that I needed to watch that thermometer, right? Because essentially it's this thing. And it's telling me how satisfied my team is. So sometimes these things are best when they spontaneously generate. And they felt like they could do that. And so that was great. I love that. It's one of my favorite stories. So no matter what metrics you use, if you're pulling metrics that are in tension, balancing each other so that you can see if I reduce my incidence over here, are we losing anything anywhere else, and so forth. Having them in the one visual space is the takeaway that I want you to get from this slide. Because if you can look at them all in one space, then you can see the impacts. It's not unlike when in a Kanban implementation or when we're working with teams that are trying to optimize their process, we tell them to visualize all of your work in one visual space so that you can see it. If you can see it all together, you can make trade-offs and manage it. This is exactly the same concept, but with different information. Okay. There is another metric. I think it's the best metric people aren't using. And this is specifically about process improvement. Okay? This is called flow efficiency. They've got this deck, so everyone will have access to it. I've got a blog post sort of explaining this a little bit more. But essentially, we talked about durations of how long it takes to get work done, right? And once it's finished, we know the start time and the end time. What we don't always capture, and takes a little forethought to get this information, is how much of that duration was spent actively working on an item versus it sitting in a queue and waiting. Okay? So if we are visualizing our work or we're somehow tracking that information, even if we're not doing it super granularly, any information will help. Then we can do a calculation. We can get a flow efficiency. So the work, the amount of the duration that's actively spent working on the thing, divided by the total duration, times 100 gives you a percentage of your flow efficiency. Now, except for I see at least one person who was here in my workshop yesterday on Kanban. We talked about this, so no cheating. Don't tell the answer. Who can tell me what a normal flow efficiency is, percent? How efficient are we at getting our work done quickly without a lot of wait time? Who wants to just hazard a guess? Okay, 25, 30, 12 to 20. Usually it's in the single digits, right? Maybe, 5% or so. And we focus so much of our efforts on how to type better, on how to actively do better on the active things that we're doing. And I'm definitely not telling people not to care about that, because you totally should care about your craft and be good at that. But when we're looking at how to make things faster, if only 5% of the total duration is spent doing the typing, it's not a lot of sense making to try to focus more on doing better typing. A lot of the time that we can reclaim in making things faster is focusing on how to reduce waits in queues. It's not sexy, but it's the big gain that we can pull out and get. So that's why I think that this is really important. And just to wrap up the whole percentage guess, maybe companies that are really focusing on this, unless you absolutely can get to where you have no dependencies whatsoever, companies that are trying hard are about 20, 25% maybe. If you have a better one, I want to hear about it. You've got my Twitter handle right here. So that's your homework. Tell me, if you measure this, what it is. Okay. Now, in all of these charts, it may not have shown the trend lines, but what we care about, instead of individual points, because that's a one thing in time, we might want to occasionally be distracted by individual data points. We care much more about the trends. In which direction are things moving? Because it tells us sort of the way we're going, how big of a shift is it, and do we really need to worry? So here's an example of a dashboard from another statistician. He's got 3 quadrants. And what's cool about this is he knows how to do all the analytics stuff because he's a lean coach and a statistician. And so he could build all of this stuff, and then he could do some predictive analytics. He could say, okay, when these trends are going this way in this combination, show this coaching advice. So it was pretty cool. I would love to be able to do that, understand how to make that happen. It's just all code, though. When you see these particular combinations, show this text. And knowing patterns that will happen and knowing things that can make those patterns better, you can code that up and make that sort of a reality. Just the same as when Amazon sees you buy this, and other people might like this other thing, other people that bought what you bought like this other thing. It's the same kind of predictive analytics, just with a different application. Okay. There is a book called How to Measure Anything by Douglas Hubbard. Okay. If you get nothing else, if you never read the book, the big takeaway is that if you have very little information to start with, you don't need a lot of information to make a big improvement. So a lot of times when we're thinking about metrics, we decide not to start because we can't get perfect numbers. Well, I can't possibly measure value because nobody knows exactly how valuable it is. But if you have no valuable information whatsoever, even if you had t-shirt size or buckets of value, that's a lot more information than you had before, and you can make a significant improvement based on just having a little bit. So get rid of the perfection fear about the data and use what's better than you have right now. Okay. So there are some missteps that even if you're following all of those steps, you walk backwards from your outcomes to your measures, and you do all those other things, you balance them, there's still some things that we can do wrong that could cause us to have unintended consequences. So I wanted to share those with you so we can try to preemptively avoid them. And the first one might be obvious by now, but over-optimizing for a single metric. Okay? So if you're focusing on speed, if you just focused on that, it would be bad news.
This is an awareness test.
I want y'all to watch this.
How many passes does the team in white make?
Go!
The answer is 13.
I heard some, yeah.
But did you see the moonwalking bear?
Oh, that's not what I wanted to do. Okay, so who did not see the moonwalking bear the first time? I didn't see it the first time either. Why don't you think you saw the moonwalking bear? Now you're always going to see it, so you're going to have to find a different video, and there aren't that many. I need to stop showing this so I can show it again in the future and people won't have seen it. But seriously, why do you think you did not see the moonwalking bear the first time? We didn't look for it. We see what we're looking for. And if we're not measuring, if we're only measuring one thing and we're only looking for one thing, that's all we're going to see. So that's why it's important to have multiple competing balanced metrics. Okay, so one more thing. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I did want to point out that in over-optimizing for a metric, it makes us have to think about spectrum thinking instead of binary. So fast is not always good. Slow is not always bad. Okay? There's a gradient. And there are negative consequences when we operate at any sort of binary extreme. And so if we're trying to find the right place to operate with the least consequences, this is just sort of a thinking model of how to think through that. So you try to visualize, if I get this metric just right, what are the outcomes that would happen? What What impacts would we see? And then if I did the extremes, if I over-amplified one direction or the other, what would I start seeing? Positive and negative. Sometimes working at extreme gives some positives and some negatives. So like here's an example. If I did too little work at one time and I just measured how fast we deliver work, it would look good. But I would miss all of the other bad things that were bored. And when bored people work, we don't do things that well. We're seen as overstaffed, so our budget's going to get cut. All of these other things, right? And of course, there's a lot of badness about keeping too much work in process. And so we can do this sort of thinking and anticipate negative outcomes, and that will also be a way to generate some ideas of which metrics to use. Okay. One other misstep is measuring individuals when you value team outcomes. Okay. We hear about the superstar, the rock star. I'm so tired of seeing job postings where you need the rock star developer or the rock star so-and-so. Superstars don't always make the best team members. So this guy is Carmelo Anthony. I sort of feel bad for him because lots of metrics talks always pick on him. But he was one of the top scorers in the NBA. Maybe he still is, I don't know. But when he did not play, his team won more often, even though he individually had superstar stats. Okay? That was confusing. Why doesn't my team win more often when this superstar I'm paying tons of money for plays? Well, it turns out that other people have a better scoring percentage. They get the shot in more times out of the same number of shots than this dude does. But he steals enough shot opportunities from other players to still score a lot of points per game. So the times he takes away from other people that could get it in more often made the scores lower overall, and his team did not win as often when he played. It's the classic example of working to make good metrics for yourself is not always the same thing as working to make good metrics for your team. So when you have a naughty list like this is from Troy McGinnis, and it's something that was in the break room at a company. So big visible break room, and it says team members that have 10 or more bugs assigned to them. Right? So if my name is on this list and the CEO walks by this thing, what am I going to do? I'm going to get my name off that list, right? Because I do not want to look like I don't know what the heck I'm doing. Now, maybe that's not the most important thing for me to be doing for the company. Maybe I'm on this assignment that has a much higher value than this 10 stupid bugs that are assigned to me, but I'm going to fix that because I look like an idiot. We don't want to put people in that position. If we care about team outcomes, measure team things. If we care about individual outcomes, measure individual things. So this is a great quote by W. Edward Deming, is that fear invites wrong figures. Essentially, when there's fear, the numbers will be wrong because people will optimize them or hide information. And so just keep that in mind. If you work in a culture of fear, it's going to be hard to trust your metrics. You need to spend time on removing some of that fear, and then you can have a little bit more trust in your metrics. Okay, one of the last ones is blindly pursuing targets. So let's take an easy example. Say I want 95% code coverage of tests, right? 95, not 94, okay? And so these people are just running towards that 95. But who's to say that 90 wasn't a good place to stop, and that 91, 92, 93%, the effort to get that 1, 2, or 3 more percent is way overshadowed, or the value of getting that is way overshadowed by the cost and effort needed to get that extra 1 or 2%. This is where the times we deploy per day makes sense at a point when we deploy like 2 times a year, and we say we need to deploy multiple times a day. Deployment frequency is a good thing to measure, right? Because we have to push so hard away from this 2 times a year, and we're having such a problem that measuring that tells us more information. But when we're deploying 100 times a day, that metric doesn't help us as much as it used to. And having just a numerical target, this is another great quote. If you give a manager a numerical target, he'll make it even if he has to destroy the organization to do it, right? So we have to be careful with our targets. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. So there is a way, we know now that metrics can have a dark side. Things can go wrong. So we can get ahead by intentionally exploring that dark side. Okay. So this is a good example of remember what you measure shows what you value. I'll give you a second to read that. Also pulls in the sort of individual metric kind of thing. Right? If this guy is measured on how many tickets he closed, how can he game that, right? Well, hi, hope you liked it, bye, right? It's not necessarily good for the company, but that metric sure is going to look good, right? Okay. So Eli Goldratt said, tell me how you'll measure me, and I'll tell you how I'll behave. And he goes on, a lot of people stop there, but I like the next part. If you measure me in illogical ways, do not complain about my illogical behavior, right? So we have a responsibility to understand that. Okay, and then if there was a good time to start a metric because we had a problem, and we know that once that problem is getting relieved and it doesn't make sense to blindly pursue a target, that means that a metric might have an expiration date. A point after which it's helpful, it becomes a target and can cause more damage than it helps at a certain point. So we need to think about when we're choosing to use a metric, maybe proactively think about when we won't need it anymore, or when it turns back into sort of background noise that we still want to monitor, but we're not primarily looking at it. I played this game with in a workshop at DevOps Day Salt Lake City. We did a workshop on how can it go to heck in a handbasket, exploring the unhappy path. And so we did a couple of exercises, this being one of them. I think this is a lot of fun to do with your teams. Take your metric, I like to be cynical. I find other technical people really like to complain and be cynical too at times. It's a venting thing. It makes you feel good. So sit there and think, what are all the things I can do to make this metric look awesome but totally destroy the world, right? Break everything we care about, but make this look great, okay? So you list all of that out. And they sat there and they did that. They thought about it themselves, turned around and talked to other people, and then shared with the group. And then we did another round of thinking and sharing, and we said, okay, all of those things, what could be the impact of doing those things? Like, what could it really break? We know it's not going to be good, but what is going to break? And then there's a couple things you can do after that. You can say, this metric isn't worth it. It's way too dangerous. Or you can say, yeah, there's risk, but we need it, so how can we make it safer? What could we measure alongside? What could we say to people? What could we do to make this safer? So what I want to leave with is that when we're choosing metrics, we often are just thinking about what we expect to get out of the metric, right? What is visible, what we see above the waterline. But there is so much there in terms of how metrics impact your organization. So I want to leave you with a desire to think about the below the waterline of your metrics iceberg. And think about what are you going to do differently on Monday, knowing the new information that you got in this talk and that you got in your other talks that you've been to or will go to in the conference. So we have a few minutes left. And I wanted to open it up to see if you have any questions, or maybe you have a good metrics tip to share that I didn't mention that you think other people might want to know about. Because I'm not the only one that knows stuff, right? You do too. So yeah, I'll take questions.
I have a question. What is your experience with your customers? How much do they want detailed metrics or high-level metrics? So you can do it like equation models or something that's slightly too high level, or what's the experience?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's probably not one single answer, but I would say especially that we need to think about the audience of who's going to look at the metrics, especially when we're thinking about, okay, the team, when they look at the metrics, they're going to want to see, they might want to see the high-level stuff too, but they might need to know about the nitty-gritty details inside of it, right? When you get up to a director level or above the team manager or more, they're going to have less need to look inside in the day-to-day details. That's not where they need to be operating, right? They need to be operating at that first high level. And then the farther you go up the chain, the more trends and higher level information they need. When you get a CEO or CIO or whatever that's in the weeds, it means they're not doing their strategy work. So we want to give people the right level of information. So I don't know, I think it's a good idea to start with the team with the details, but also show the trends. But when you get to director levels and above, on one of the slides where trends was important, all the points were actually taken off, and it just showed the trend lines. So that is maybe something that you want to do for the higher level executives in management so they don't get in the weeds. But if they want to talk about them, then fine. You can bring that in, but start with sort of the higher level so they don't get distracted from their goal at hand. Yeah.
Should we split your metrics into like short-term goals and long-term goals, or should they just be?
I don't think there's a wrong answer to that question. If you ignore any type of goal, it's probably a bad thing. So you should probably have some short-term and some long-term. But if we start having way too many metrics on the table, then they're all going to sort of lose a little bit of meaning. You can't be monitoring 400 metrics all at once. So I think probably the best thing to do is to have a group for short-term, for medium-term, for long-term. Maybe you have a balanced quadrant or something if you're going to use that model for each length of goal. Yeah, it's worth trying. Yeah. Yes. Favorite set of tools. I found that a lot of the tools have some great metrics and some crappy metrics. I'm trying not to be too fangirlish here. But so I used to work at LeanKit. That's a Kanban tool. They have some decent metrics. Some of the slides that I took, especially around cycle time and duration, are there. And some of those are good. Jira has some okay metrics. But there is a suite of measuring software called Actionable Agile. And that is really good. And I know that the math is sound because I know the people who wrote that. And they have really good probabilistic forecasting. They've got great duration and flow metrics. But I don't know quite as much about the tools on the from code commit to deploy. So I would say start with what you have and see what you can use out of what you have, and then go somewhere else if you need. But don't use that as an excuse not to start because you don't have the right tools. Just start with, start analog if you need to. Yeah.
I want to ask, when you want to measure team productivity in a Scrum or Kanban workflow, would you suggest to use working time for tracking or the story points thing? What is your...
I wouldn't use either one of those. I don't like to use I do like to use cycle time, so from the duration, but I don't like to have people track their time in 15-minute increments. So I'm not sure which one you meant. If you meant the first one, cycle time, then yes, great. I like to track number of items completed if I'm going to use a productivity metric. That's much more understood than velocity or story points, because that is extremely subjective in the fact that it's hard for teams to understand in the first place. And Larry Matroni, I've talked about him a couple of times. One of the things that he did with a lot of his data sets was that he compared the effectiveness of using story points versus throughput, which is story counts. And he did find that story points were slightly more accurate, but only not statistically significant. And it's much more expensive from effort and overhead to get that. So throughput was cheaper and almost exactly as accurate. So that's a data-backed reason why I like to use throughput. But I like the conversations that you get when you talk about the points and the learning about the stories. I just don't like the points themselves. That's just personal. I'm not, use it if you want. Okay, well, we're time, so thank you so much. And I will be around the rest of the day if you have any questions, and you can find me on all of these places. And like I said, they have the slide deck, and so I believe they're putting those out because they've been coming to get those slide decks, so they should all be available. So thank you so much.